Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS Legal Hotline Lawyer. And today we're going to talk about a problem that is becoming a bigger problem all the time within our real estate industry. And that is brokers hiring other brokers for the purpose of showing homes or providing access to appraisers or inspectors. Typically, it's a broker in one geographical location of the state hiring a broker in another geographical location of the state. And these showing services or concierge showing services are becoming a big problem. DOL is discovering these problems through audits and through complaints. DOL has reviewed a number of broker transactions, firms, I should say, reviewed a number of firms where brokers are engaged in either hiring other brokers or being hired as the broker. And in all of the audits and in all of the complaints DOL has investigated, they have not yet found a single firm that is complying with what would be required of a firm in a scenario like this. And cutting to the chase, in DOL's experience, every single firm that's been audited on this subject or had a complaint reviewed has chosen, in the face of trying to come into compliance, has chosen instead to simply stop participating, either by hiring other brokers or by being the broker that gets hired. And one of the biggest problems that's been discovered, designated brokers, is that you are too often unaware of the fact that brokers in your firm are being hired or are hiring brokers directly to provide these services for designated brokers for your client. Because remember, when a seller lists with a firm, lists their property, they are signing a contract with the firm. And the designated broker and the firm are ultimately responsible to that seller for the provision of real estate brokerage services. When a buyer is represented by a broker, they are represented by the broker's firm and then by the buyer broker. The firm is responsible for the brokerage services provided to that buyer. So if a buyer broker is located on one side of the state and they're selling property on another side of the state and hiring a local broker to open the home for the buyer to see the home or for an inspector, an appraiser, or whatever it might be, or if a broker on one side of the state has listed property located on the other side of the state and they have to rely on a local broker to access the home for showing or for inspections, there's a problem. So what are the problems then? If DOL says they haven't yet found a firm in compliance, what would be required to come into compliance? Well, let's start with compensation. If one broker is compensating another broker money to provide real estate brokerage services, because that's what the broker is doing. When they open the house and they let a buyer in and they're showing the house to the buyer, they're providing real estate brokerage services. Broker on one side of the state cannot compensate another broker on the other side of the state directly for the provision of real estate brokerage services. It can't be Venmoing a few dollars. It can't be a gift card of a few dollars. It can't be cash of a few dollars. And by a few dollars, I'm using that number because I don't want to state a specific amount, but there is a range, and it's never a huge dollar amount. But there's pretty typical amounts that these showing services or one broker hiring another broker will pay. And it's typically enough to get the broker out the door using their key, open the house, and it compensates their time. Oftentimes, DOL says we hear that it also gives brokers who have less experience and less clientele exposure to showing houses, familiarity with that process of showing houses. But one broker cannot compensate another broker. What about agency? Who does the showing broker represent? Is it disclosed to the consumer who they represent? Who's supervising that broker? I said a few minutes ago that oftentimes what DOL discovers is that designated brokers or the firms don't even know this is happening. So if a broker is going out and opening homes and showing buyers, who's supervising that broker if their designated broker doesn't know that they're doing that? And let's say that you're the buyer broker's firm located on one side of the state and the buyer's on the other side of the state looking at properties with a broker who's not licensed to your firm. Then designated broker, you have authority over, you are ultimately responsible for this agency relationship to the buyer who's getting services from a broker over in this part of the state over whom you have no supervision. So we've got a problem with the broker who's showing the property, and we've got a problem with the broker who's hired that broker, who's supposed to be providing brokerage services under the supervision of their designated broker, but isn't. So the consumer's out there with a broker unsupervised by the designated broker that has the agency relationship with the buyer. What about records? Who's keeping records of anything that happens in that transaction by the showing broker, including material communications? There are probably other issues that are not in my head at the moment, but again, Department of Licensing says there is not a single firm in the face of all of the aspects of compliance that would be required that has chosen to come into compliance. Perhaps starting with the fact that compliance requires compliance by the firm in a transaction where more often than not, the firm isn't even getting compensated. One of the brokers licensed to the firm is making a few dollars, but the firm's not making anything. Yet in an audit, it's the firm that gets in trouble because the firm has failed to meet the record-keeping requirements, has failed to supervise, has brokers who are receiving compensation outside of the license law. Designated brokers, you need to ask this question of your brokers directly. Are you providing showing services? Are you offering to compensate other brokers for showing services? And again, showing services typically include opening a home for a consumer to view the home, could also include opening a home for an inspector, an appraiser, but don't limit your questioning to these scenarios because there may be other opportunities as well for one broker to hire another broker, compensate them for the provision of real estate brokerage services, and that in and of itself is unlawful. If you have a question about this or anything else, please log into the Washington REALTORS website, follow the links to the Legal Hotline Library, and ask a question if you have a question after you review the Q&As already in the library. Thank you for being a Washington REALTOR member.